What is the definition of Indigenous education? When you go back to elementary school or high school, what can you remember about the things that were taught regarding Indigenous people? Indigenous education can include multiple topics such as historical truths taught in schools, the teaching of Indigenous traditional knowledge, and education models taught within Indigenous communities. Indigenous education in Canada has historically been distributed in a restrictive colonialist framework, framing the narrative from the colonizer's perspective of divide and conquer. Our presentation aims to explore the notion of decolonizing education through critical assessments of how it can be improved and integrated with Indigenous knowledge to continue the dialogue towards healing for the future of Indigenous peoples and Canadian settlers alike. Existing curricula pertaining to Indigenous education and history fail to provide space and amplify the voices of Indigenous educators and scholars who would be best suited to deliver such content and materials. One of the reasons this occurs is that the elders are not recognized as teachers in our existing school system, a system that considers degrees or diplomas and other colonial concepts to qualify individuals as educators. In Indigenous communities, elders teach the 5 characteristics of knowledge: personal, orally collective sharing, experimental, holistic, and the narrative of the traditional stories. And they are qualified through years of mentorship and teaching. The current curriculum in Canada is lacking in appropriate resources, leading to inconsistent learning across the country. Content that is sourced is often outdated, void of Indigenous representation, and with the potential to be taught from a colonial angle. Curran Jacobs, an Indigenous resource teacher in Quebec, confirms what we now know, stating, "A lot of what ends up being integrated into the curriculum comes from the teachers themselves." In this current state, we continue to nurture ignorance as stated by Seema Ahluwalia of the SJC by psychic distancing, collective denial, historical amnesia, and cognitive imperialism. The current system educates and assesses all children as equals without taking into consideration the way that our historical past has created an education gap for Indigenous students. Educators are not trained or prepared for the possibility that Indigenous students and families may see school as a dangerous place where they have been forced into assimilative practices. Critical pedagogy author Stephenson-Malett documents that the inequities that exist for many Indigenous students, such as poverty, food insecurity, unemployment, and limited access to safe housing, are the result of years of colonial practices which have led to severe disadvantages for Indigenous communities who are lacking in resources to face these challenges. Much work needs to be done to fulfill the commitment of the calls to action that were made by the TRC, detailing how education is the key to reconciliation, promising the exact content that we need, but still 6 years later don't have. In order to teach and share Indigenous knowledge, educational institutions must consult the expertise of elders, healers, and traditional knowledge keepers from their respective communities to form and implement the Indigenous curricula. This is imperative, as including the perspectives and approaches of leaders from Indigenous communities recognizes the value of teachings outside of the traditionally colonialist framework. This can also symbolize a meaningful step towards nurturing an equitable grounds for education and learning for all. Some ideas we'd like to propose. 1. Develop and expand on equitable, governmentally funded education initiatives catered towards Indigenous identifying individuals that offer financial incentives upon completion of secondary and post-secondary diplomas and degrees. 2. Make Indigenous-led and oriented learnings, for example, courses, workshops, seminars, entirely free and readily accessible, especially for the more remote communities. And 3. Secure positions for Indigenous scholars in management and leadership positions to guide and structure education at all levels from an authentically decolonized approach. If we remove some of the barriers that discourage Indigenous people from seeking to further their education, we can see a marginalized community begin to prosper again. There have been, in particular, some Indigenous scholars who have proposed thoughtful recommendations to the Saskatchewan Educational Leadership Unit, suggesting that in order to achieve meaningful collaboration and change through the application of the concept ethical spaces, as articulated by Willie Ermine, 3 elements must be met: the nurturing of dignified mutual relationships, tackling poverty and racism, and the genuine recognition of First Nations and Métis cultures and languages. By ensuring that these particular goals are met, education can be reimagined in a way where Indigenous peoples and settlers alike can appreciate a trusting, respectful space that promotes cooperation and partnerships towards collectively ethical goals. This approach can help revitalize Indigenous history, knowledge, language, and cultures while serving to benefit both Indigenous and settler learners alike. Further, it will permit the space to strengthen stronger relationships with the land and all of creation.